The Minister has indicated that's fair enough.
Excellent.
I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And while Holly Walker's supplementary order paper remains live, one question I wanted to raise, Mr Speaker, is whether or not perhaps the member may consider splitting the two clauses that have sought to be amended in this SOP, because it seems that at present the financial veto hangs quite closely to the recovery of payments made in excess of authorised rates, the Section 86 SOP. And the Minister has given an explanation which suggests that the financial veto is because this would incur a cost on the Crown because of their inability to do debt recovery. Now, I think that sits quite separately to Clause 37A, because debt recovery does allow the discretion of recouping costs from an individual at a very low rate over a particular period of time. Whereas Clause 37A, in contrast, instead gives the discretion to the Chief Executive not to impose a sanction, and a sanction being quite a bit more onerous in terms of the amount of money it would remove from an individual than, for instance, debt recovery. And it gives this SOP, talks about giving discretion to the Chief Executive not to impose a sanction on an individual if they haven't complied with their work obligations, if the Chief Executive determines that that sanction would deprive a child of food or shelter or would be otherwise detrimental to the well-being of the child. Now, the Minister, when she referred to this clause, to this amendment, suggested that that could come at a cost to the Crown of between $200 and $300 million. Now, that wasn't stated in the financial veto. So I would expect that if the department is going to go away and rework that financial veto, if that indeed is the cost that could be incurred by the Crown of this discretionary provision, that should be included in the financial veto, because I would be extremely surprised if using the sanctions set out in 117 of the Social Security Act meant that $200 to $300 million per annum in sanctions was being imposed on those on the domestic purposes benefit with a dependent child. And if that is the case, this House should know about that, because we're not talking about incremental sanctions here. What we're talking about is if an individual on a domestic purposes benefit refuses to take up work, for instance, when their child is potentially 1 year old, if they've had a second child, if they refuse to take up work, part-time work, as instructed by the Ministry of Social Development, under the Social Security Act, Section 117, the sanctions the Chief Executive must apply in respect of those failures is 1, the person's benefit must be reduced by 50% until the person recomplies, and 2, if the person is not recomplied within 4 weeks after the date on which the reduction took effect, the person's benefit must be reduced by a further 50% so that the total reduction is 100%. A second failure and a third failure finally means the cancellation of a benefit. These aren't incremental sanctions, they are significant. Now, if the Minister is telling me from the Chair that imposing the ability of a Chief Executive to have discretion over the use of those sanctions where a child is involved would cost the Crown $200 to $300 million per year, then I'd be interested in that. And if that's not true, I invite the Minister to clarify her statement when she rises from the Chair, because otherwise I would have assumed that the cost to the Crown of giving discretion to a Chief Executive would not be that significant, certainly not enough to warrant a financial veto, because it is ultimately a discretionary power, because it relies on the individual circumstances to be taken into account. And what we're asking is that they take into account whether or not it would have an undue impact on a child if involved where a sanction were being imposed. And I think it was a very reasonable SOP. I'd like to see it considered separately to the SOP relating to the recovery of payments. And perhaps if the SOP is still live, perhaps the member may have a chance to submit that SOP separately, and it may therefore be salvaged from a financial veto unless the Minister can explain where those figures she used came from. I'd like to, Mr Chair, in my remaining time, speak to a couple of other parts of Part 3. Of course, these are the substantive parts around work testing provisions. We've already, Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you. I'm pleased to finish my substantive points on Part 3. And obviously this part brings in work testing provisions and is an extension on the government's existing program. Future Focus was the first tranche of work testing reforms that the Minister brought in. So we do already have some evidence to suggest what's happening, particularly with those on the domestic purposes benefit around declared earnings, because that's basically the measure we can use to assess whether or not those on the domestic purposes benefit, when extra work testing is being applied, are moving into part-time work. Interestingly enough, the figures when Future Focus were introduced sat around 16% of those on a domestic purposes benefit having some declared earnings. And although there's been some incremental changes, it hasn't roughly moved away from being roughly between 16 and 17%. And so that does suggest that work testing provisions are still very heavily dependent on the nature of work available. And when you're in a recessionary environment, obviously the availability of work is affected, but so is the nature of the work that's available. And demand in particular, we've seen from the Household Labour Force survey, demand for additional hours has increased significantly. The number of people taking on part-time work has increased. Therefore, the number of available part-time jobs for those who are having part-time work tests against them, that pool of jobs is reduced. And I would say that would be my assessment of why we have, even when new work testing regimes being introduced, very little movement around those who are declaring additional earnings. In fact, if you want to see where there was a significant increase in declared earnings, the last time, I think and I'm going from memory here, Mr Chair, we saw it sitting higher than that was roughly 2006-2007, when from memory it was sitting at about 20%. The economy, the nature of the job market certainly matters, and we have implored the government all the way through here to consider allowing greater flexibility in the imposition of sanctions because of the nature of the economic environment on which these measures are being imposed. And so that's why I would contend that SOPs like those from Holly Walker are very fitting, given what the evidence suggests is happening in our job market at present. The second point that I want to raise in Part 3 is that given the nature of the economic climate matters, given the ability to demonstrate you have the education and skills required for the jobs available, and given that the third issue we know that affects ability to move in to fulfil work test obligations is childcare arrangements. I'm interested as to whether or not the Minister considered the extension of the subsidy for childcare, which she has, I think rightly, extended for teen parents. So the subsidy now sits at $6, which we're told by the Ministry of Education should substantively cover the cost of childcare for those teen parents. Did she consider extending that to a wider range of domestic purpose benefits recipients? Because I do commend the government for that subsidy increase, but there are a large number of DPB recipients who would have benefited enormously from that extension being applied to them also. Was it simply a fiscal consideration? Was it not considered necessary for the over 90,000 who have sole parent obligations, Mr Chair? And so I would be interested in that from the Minister. I also have a question for the Minister around the discretion used by Work and Income when they're making a decision over a part-time work test obligation versus plans establishing planning for employment, and whether or not there's a hierarchy between the two. I'd like to give an example. I recently had a case brought to my attention where a DPB recipient wanted to enter into training in order to complete a nursing diploma. And she needed to seek some assistance from Work and Income in order to enter into that program. The information she received from Work and Income was that they weren't interested in assisting with that because she was already in part-time work, and as far as they were concerned, that was the goal that they had for her as a welfare recipient. She was still dependent on the domestic purposes benefit. She only had 10 hours of work per week. It was not enough to sustain her and her child. She felt that without getting the training required to move her into a higher wage job, she would forever remain dependent while her child was of school age at least. So, Minister, I'd be interested to see whether or not you have a hierarchy in terms of those situations.
I call the honourable member Mike Sabin.
Thank you, Mr Chair. As a former police officer, I rise to take a call on this